stood at the edge of my sister's wedding reception in a dress I'd paid $400 for, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched. Watching the man I'd been engaged to for 2 years dance with her under string lights, we used to talk about having at our wedding. His name was Levi, hers was Brooke, and I was just the sister who showed up anyway because my mother said it would look bad if I didn't. That night feels like a lifetime ago now, but I need to go back further than that, back to where any of this actually started, because the ending doesn't make sense without the beginning. I was 31 when Levi proposed. We'd been together for 3 years, met at a fundraiser for a children's hospital where I worked as a pediatric occupational therapist. He was charming in the way that men are charming when they want something from you and haven't yet decided what. I didn't see that then. I saw the way he looked at me across a room full of strangers and smiled like I was the only person there. We got engaged on a Tuesday in February. He took me to a little Italian place in Midtown, nothing fancy. And when the ring came out, I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. Happy crying. Pure and uncomplicated and embarrassing in retrospect. I called Brooke first. Before my mother, before my best friend, before anyone. She was the person I always called first. She squealed. She said she was so happy for me. She asked me to describe the ring in detail. I described it. I didn't know she was already picturing it on her own hand. We set the wedding for the following October. 14 months to plan something I'd been dreaming about since I was a little girl, cutting pictures of white dresses out of my mother's old magazines. I threw myself into it. The venue, the flowers, the invitations with the little wax seals that took me 3 evenings to get right. Brooke was my maid of honor. She was with me for every tasting, every fitting, every moment that mattered. Looking back, I can trace the exact point when things shifted. It was July, 4 months before the wedding. Levi started working late. Not occasionally, reliably, every Tuesday and Thursday. I didn't question it. He was a regional manager for a construction supply company and the summer was busy. I told myself that. I told myself a lot of things. Brooke started canceling plans, small things, lunch here, a shopping trip there. Always a good reason. She was tired. She had a headache. Her car was making a noise. I didn't add it up because I wasn't looking for an equation. It was my coworker Patrice. Not a close friend, just someone I shared a break room with, who mentioned she'd seen Brooke and Levi having dinner at a restaurant downtown. She brought it up casually, the way you mention something you assume the other person already knows about. She said something like, "Oh, I saw your sister and your fiancé last week. They seemed like they were having a nice time." And then she went back to her yogurt. I drove home that evening with my hands at 10 and 2 and my mind completely blank. Like the channel had been switched off. I didn't confront either of them that night. I waited. I needed to be sure. I needed to be wrong. I wasn't wrong. I found out on a Saturday morning in August when I came home early from a certification workshop that it ended ahead of schedule. The house Levi and I had been renting together, the one with the yellow kitchen he painted himself as a surprise, was quiet in a way that didn't feel like empty. It felt like held breath. I won't go into what I walked in on. Some things don't need detail to be understood. What I will say is that it was my sister, and it was my home, and it was 2 months before my wedding. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a very long time. Then I put my keys on the counter, very quietly, and I left. I drove to a park 3 miles away and sat in my car for 2 hours. I didn't cry. I couldn't. It was like the part of me that knew how to cry had simply gone offline, decided this was too large for tears, and shut down entirely. I sat there until a family with 2 small kids set up a picnic blanket near my car, and the sound of normal life felt so unbearable that I had to leave. I stayed with my friend Cassidy that night. She didn't ask many questions. She made me tea and put on a nature documentary and sat with me on the couch until I fell asleep. That kind of kindness. The quiet kind that doesn't demand anything from you is something I've never forgotten. Levi called 17 times before midnight. I didn't answer. Brooke called twice. I didn't answer. My mother called once, which told me that Brooke had already gotten to her. I broke off the engagement the following week. Returned the ring, moved out of the house with Cassidy's help, and the reluctant assistance of her boyfriend, who carried boxes without being asked and made himself invisible in the way that good people do when they can feel that a situation requires silence. I canceled the venue, the flowers, the caterer. I lost deposits. I lost money. I didn't have to lose because I was a pediatric OT in private practice. Not wealthy, just careful. I'd been saving for 2 years for that wedding, and I spent a long, painful week on the phone dismantling it piece by piece. My mother called during that week to tell me that I was overreacting. I hung up. She called back to say that these things are complicated and that Brooke hadn't meant for it to happen. I hung up again. She didn't call a third time. What happened over the next 2 years is the part of the story that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There was no montage. There was no montage. There was no moment where I woke up and felt better. There was just work. The slow, unglamorous work of building a life back up when you've lost not just a relationship but the entire vision of your future you'd been carrying around. I threw myself into my career. I'd been thinking about specializing in sensory processing work with autistic children for a while, and I finally enrolled in the advanced training. It was intense and expensive, and some days I came home so tired I ate cereal standing over the sink. But I was learning something I cared about, and I was good at it. And when you've had the rug pulled out from under your sense of self, being good at something becomes a kind of anchor. I moved to a different part of the city, not because I had to, but because I wanted a neighborhood that had no history with me. Fresh walls, new coffee shops, people who didn't know anything about what had happened. I started running in the mornings, not because I needed to lose weight or because I had some inspirational story about it. I started running because it was the only time of day when my brain was too busy keeping me upright to replay things I didn't want to remember. I met my husband through work. His name is Elliot. He's an architect who volunteers his time designing accessible spaces for rehabilitation centers, which is how he ended up at a conference I was attending in Chicago, 20 minutes late, sitting down next to me with a paper cup of coffee and an apologetic expression and asking in a low voice whether he'd missed anything important. I told him he'd missed the opening remarks, but not the good part. He smiled and said, "Perfect timing then." I'd been suspicious of charming men for long enough that I didn't let myself read into it. We ended up in the same breakout session, then the same dinner group, then talking at the hotel bar until 11:30 when I realized I had an 8 a.m. panel and excused myself. He asked for my card. I gave it to him with the specific intention of never thinking about it again. He emailed the next morning, a real email. 3 paragraphs, references to actual things we talked about, no games. I didn't know then that he was the kind of man who meant what he said and said what he meant, consistently, without performance. I figured that out over the next 8 months. Slowly, because I needed to go slowly, and he never once made me feel like that was a problem. We got married quietly, a year and a half after Chicago. Small ceremony at a botanical garden outside the city. 12 people. Cassidy as my witness. His college roommate as his. Dinner at a farm-to-table restaurant afterward where the owner brought out a cake they hadn't ordered because someone in the kitchen had overheard it was a wedding and decided to do something kind. I did not invite my mother. I did not invite Brooke. I had made a decision, somewhere in those 2 years of rebuilding, that I was not obligated to maintain relationships that had cost me something fundamental. That forgiveness was mine to give or not give, and that the version of forgiveness I chose, the kind where you release the anger without reopening the door, was enough. I didn't owe anyone a reconciliation. Life felt clean in a way it hadn't in years. Then Brooke called. Not a text. An actual call, which was so unusual that I almost didn't pick up. But I was in my car outside the grocery store, and something, curiosity maybe, or just the particular exhaustion of carrying old things, made me answer. She started crying almost immediately, told me that Levi had left her, that he'd been cheating on her for the better part of a year with someone he worked with, that she had a lease she couldn't afford on her own, credit card debt she hadn't known about, and a situation that was, in her words, a total disaster. She didn't say she was sorry. Not in that call. She said she needed help. I sat in my car outside the grocery store for a long moment after she finished talking. Then I said, "Brooke, I'm really sorry that happened to you." And I meant it. I did. Because there's a difference between the satisfaction of knowing that someone got what they deserved and actual cruelty, and I didn't want to be cruel. I just didn't want to be her solution. I told her I wasn't the right person to help her with this. I said it the way you'd say it to anyone. Not cold, not warm, just clear. I told her I hoped she figured things out. And then I said goodbye. She called back 3 times. I let it go to voicemail. My mother texted a week later. Did you talk to your sister? No question mark. The way she'd always sent texts like punctuation was optional when you were the parent. I replied, yes. She texted back and I didn't reply to that one. What I hadn't expected, what I genuinely could not have predicted, was that Brooke and Elliot knew each other. I found out at Cassidy's birthday dinner 6 weeks later. Cassidy had invited a mix of people, old friends and newer ones, and Elliot came with me. We were at a long table at a Spanish restaurant in the neighborhood, the kind with good wine and bad lighting and a noise level that forces everyone closer together. At some point, the conversation turned to the city's new accessible transit project, something Elliot had some professional awareness of. And someone mentioned a community meeting that had apparently been contentious. Elliot went quiet in a specific way. Not uncomfortable quiet. Recognition. Quiet. Later, in the car home, I asked him about it. He told me that about 3 years ago, before he and I had ever met, he'd been briefly seeing someone he'd connected with through a mutual friend. It hadn't been serious. They'd gone on 4 or 5 dates. He'd ended it because she had a quality he didn't know how to describe except to say that she treated service workers the way some people treat furniture. Not mean, exactly. Just entirely indifferent to their existence. He showed me a photo. Old one. From what looked like a work event. It was Brooke. I made a sound I can't quite describe. Something between a laugh and a breath that gets knocked out of you. He looked at me. Do you know her? I told him. He sat with it for a moment. Then he said, so she tried to steal your life before you even had this one. I don't know why that particular sentence hit me the way it did. Maybe because it was accurate. Maybe because it reframed something I'd been carrying as a wound and made it look instead like a near miss. Like I'd stepped off the curb half a second before a car came through. 2 weeks after that dinner, Cassie called me to tell me that Brooke had reached out to her. Mutual connections, smaller city than it seems. And that the conversation had eventually turned to me. Apparently Brooke had said some things, that I'd always been cold, that I'd cut off the family over something that wasn't that serious, that I'd done fine for myself anyway, so what was the big deal? Cassidy, who was not a confrontational person by nature, had responded by listing, calmly and specifically, every deposit I'd lost, every weekend I'd spent on the phone canceling vendors, and the name of the park where I'd sat in my car for 2 hours on the worst day of my life. Brooke had gone quiet. Cassidy told me this not to stir anything up, but because she thought I deserved to know that someone had said those things out loud on my behalf. I didn't do anything with the information right away. There wasn't anything to do. The moment that became a story happened a few months later, at a professional event, an annual gala for a pediatric health nonprofit that I'd been involved with for 3 years as a volunteer. It was the kind of evening where everyone dresses up and pretends the chicken is better than it is and genuinely cares about the work being recognized. Elliot came as my guest. We knew a handful of people there. I didn't know Brooke would be there. She worked for a PR firm that had recently taken the nonprofit on as a client. I found this out when I looked up from a conversation I was having near the bar and saw her across the room holding a glass of wine, looking polished and composed in a way that told me she'd rebuilt herself too, at least on the outside. She saw me at the same moment. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she walked over. Which surprised me. I'd expected her to find a reason to stay on the other side of the room. She looked good. That's the honest thing to say. She looked put together and professional, and the way you look when you've worked to present a version of yourself to the world. She air-kissed my cheek like we were colleagues who'd met at a previous event, and she said it was so good to see me, and asked how I was doing. I said I was well. She said she'd heard I'd gotten married, asked about my husband. I said yes, about a year and a half ago. Small ceremony, very happy. Something moved across her face. Not quite envy and not quite regret. Something more complicated than either. Then she said, and I want to get this right because the exact words mattered. She said, "You always did land on your feet, didn't you? Even when the rest of us were struggling." It was said pleasantly, with a smile, The kind of thing that's designed to read as a compliment if anyone nearby is listening and land as something else entirely in the chest of the person it's aimed at. I took a breath. I didn't say what I wanted to say, which was something about whose choices had caused whose struggles. I didn't perform anything. I just looked at her for a moment, really looked at her the way you look at something you used to be afraid of and realize you aren't anymore. And I said, yes, I did. That was all. She blinked. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't that. Maybe she'd expected defensiveness. Maybe she'd expected warmth. The door reopened. The relationship that could still be salvaged. Maybe she'd wanted the reaction. Any reaction. Because a reaction would mean she still had some claim on my attention. I gave her nothing but the truth. Then Elliot appeared at my side. He'd been talking to someone from the nonprofit's board, and he put his hand on the small of my back in that easy, natural way that people who are genuinely at home with each other do. And he said hello to Brooke in the tone of someone who has no particular investment in the conversation. She looked at him. He looked at her. The moment where she recognized him was small. Just a slight stilling of the face, a recalibration happening behind the eyes. He'd clearly crossed her mind at some point, not as someone important, but as someone. And now, here he was. My husband. At my side. At an event she was working. She recovered quickly. She always was good at recovering. She said it was lovely to meet him and that she should get back to her colleagues, and she excused herself and moved smoothly across the room, and I didn't watch her go. Elliot leaned down and said quietly, near my ear, "That was her, wasn't it?" Not a question. "Yes," I said. He looked at me for a moment. "You okay?" I thought about it honestly. The room was warm and the music was something low, and the work being honored that night was real work that helped real children. And I was standing there with a man who sent 3-paragraph emails and meant what he said, and had walked into my life 20 minutes late with a paper cup of coffee, and perfect timing. "Yeah," I said. "I really am." We stayed another 2 hours. We talked to people we liked. We ate the mediocre chicken. We drank good wine. At one point, I caught Brooke's eye across the room, and she looked away first, and I felt something inside me go very quiet. Not triumphant, not sad, just finished. Like a chapter that had been half open for years had finally, quietly, closed. On the drive home, Elliot asked me what I was thinking about. I told him I was thinking about the park where I'd sat in my car for 2 hours on the worst day of my life. About how I'd watched a family set up a picnic blanket and felt like the normalcy of it was unbearable. About how that same normalcy, people going about their lives, the small ordinary textures of things, was now just my life. He reached over and took my hand on the center console without saying anything. That's the thing about landing on your feet. It's not a talent, and it's not luck, and it's not some quality you either have or don't. It's just the decision, made quietly and without an audience, to keep walking even when the ground has dropped out from under you. To keep going until the ground comes back, and to notice, really notice, when it finally does. The rest is just living, and living well turned out to be more than enough.